This may come as a surprise to people, but this ground you are seeing right now, Cardinia Park, is actually perfectly legal under the present laws of Australian football. The modern AFL seems to have moved away from the uniqueness of differently shaped grounds, with Footy Park and Subiaco Oval replaced with the Adelaide Oval, in fairness longer than the MCG, and Perth Stadium, but the addition of GWS and Gold Coast adding matches at the Sydney Showgrounds and Carrara, done up so to be MCG size, it feels like it's an element of the game that's been lost, and that is where Cardinia Park stands out. And that is thanks in some degree to this man. He ruined a lot of things, not least the style of that moustache, but he also ruined the chances of a team going down to Geelong and winning. With the military using Carrara Oval, the club committee, by a unanimous vote, decided to shift both home games and eventually the club's headquarters from the old Carrara Oval to the new Cardinia Park. The World War made things difficult for Geelong. When you hear the idea that the expansion from 9 to 12 teams in 1925 until South Melbourne's move to Sydney in 1982, nothing changed in the VFL, that isn't exactly true. In fact, there was great change as the iconic identity and for some the iconic jumpers for some teams first came about during this period. But in 1942 and 1943, it forced Geelong into recess. This was done by many teams, including Geelong during the First World War. Geelong, after all, did not participate in the 1916 season, but Geelong was the only team forced to do this thing during the second. Geelong came back into the league for 1944, but struggled, racking up the third wooden spoon in the history of the club. Geelong remained languishing at the bottom of the table. The only man who could save them from the abyss, Reg Hickey, is back. For the third time, he is the coach of the Cats, and this time he is a non-playing coach. Reg Hickey's reign as non-playing coach began in 1949. Geelong improved by 2 wins, finishing 8th. In 1950, Geelong increased its wins by 1 match, but jumped 4 places in a tight ladder. 4th to 9th was separated by just a win and a half, but Geelong got into finals via percentage before taking on Melbourne in the elimination final, a matchup that had seen the teams split the results when they played during the home and away season. A 9-1 second half saw Geelong roll over the top of Melbourne to go on to win by 44 points. The preliminary final would see Geelong take out a 7-1 lead at the end of the first quarter, but the Kangaroos clawed their way back into the match and ended up winning by 17 points. North Melbourne would lose the grand final to Essendon, winning their second straight premiership. 1951 for Geelong was off to a sloppy start. After a round 1 win over South Melbourne at home, back-to-back losses away from home against Fitzroy and Collingwood, Geelong well and truly needed to turn their season the other way around. And they did just that, winning 10 games on the bounce until a narrow, low-scoring loss to Collingwood at Cardinia Park. Collingwood at Cardinia Park, that's a rather unfamiliar statement. In spite of the loss to Collingwood, Geelong stood on top of the ladder, still a game and 13.8% clear of the second-place Magpies. After a 22-point win over Carlton, Geelong's confidence took a strike right in the heart in round 16 at Windy Hill against the Bombers. John Coleman and Bill Hutchison each kicked 5 majors, and Ron McEwen kicked 4. The Cats never got into the match and trailed at every change. Essendon led by 25 at quarter time, 35 at half time, 48 at three-quarter time, and 58 at full time. Geelong kicking 8 goals, 17 behinds, with only 1 Cat kicking multiple goals on the day. 4 Bombers did so. This was not only a terrible performance, it became a disaster thanks to the margin of defeat, and in addition to Collingwood's 22-point victory over Richmond, the Magpies jumped to first place by 1%. Geelong needed to turn their season around again, and the following round, they would do that against North Melbourne. The Kangaroos were kept to a mere 1 first-quarter goal through the first 3 terms, Geelong winning by 69 points, and with Collingwood getting up by just the 1 point in their match against South Melbourne, it restored a Geelong first-place spot on the ladder by 6.9%. Geelong would hold on to the top spot, Essendon finishing 3rd, and they were the talk of the footy world heading into the finals. Well, not Essendon, an Essendon player, John Coleman. Not for the reason you might expect. He was undoubtedly a freakish footballer, and so great was his ability to kick goals every year, the man who kicks the most goals in a season receives an award, the Coleman Medal. Famously, Coleman only played 98 VFL games, largely due to injury, but he could have, and in fact should have cracked the ton, if only for what happened in that final round of 1951. Coleman was reported for striking Carlton's Harry Casper during their round 18 match at Princes Park. Casper had been niggling Coleman since the very start of the match, which included making persistent and heavy contact with a nasty boil on Coleman's neck. That Casper had punched Coleman twice whilst play was at the other end of the ground, immediately before Coleman retaliated. At the tribunal, Casper's case was heard first. He was suspended for 4 weeks. Coleman's defence was simple. He had simply retaliated to 2 unprovoked punches from Casper for which he had been suspended. Both the boundary umpire Herb Kent and goal umpire Allen gave evidence that Coleman had retaliated only after being punched twice by Casper. The expectation was that the retaliation would be suspended less than the instigator. That is not what happened. Coleman got a 4-week ban. In the second semi-final between the two top teams in the competition, Geelong and Collingwood, Geelong started the game very nervously with the semi-final jitters getting to Geelong in the early stages of the match, but Geelong settled down and increased the pace of play, and Collingwood were unable to prevent a Big Cats win. Bernie Smith, Billy McMaster and Terry Fulton were the best of field for Geelong, and wayward kicking was the only really disappointing element of the game for Geelong. The Cats had beaten the Magpies 22-20, 152 to 10-10-70, an 82-point thrashing over a team that had beaten Geelong in Geelong not that long previously. The star of the day, however, was one man, George Gonyan. Gonyan, who played just the 9 games for Essendon in a 4-year period, would go to Geelong and become a champion full forward. In 1951, he kicked more goals than anyone else, and in that semi-final, he set the joint record for most goals in a VFL final with 11. Geelong would take on the Coleman-less Essendon in the grand final, who squeezed past Collingwood by 2 points in the preliminary final the week before, who are going for back-to-back premierships. Essendon, as a result of both injury and suspension, highlighted by the missing John Coleman, had to go to desperate measures ahead of the 1951 VFL Grand Final. Bombers rockman John Gill withdrew from the Grand Final the morning of. Fred Payne replaced Gill on the side, but Essendon was still in need of a 19th man. Enter Dick Reynolds, the legend of the club who had retired from playing the previous year and was the coach of the side. He would come out of retirement to play a 320th game for Essendon, back to what he did in the match itself in a moment's time. Geelong started the game the better, but were hit and miss in front of goal. Geelong led at quarter time 3-8 to 1 goal. Essendon worked their way back into the match in the second quarter, but it was during the third where the match turned in Geelong's favour, with 2 late Geelong goals extending the lead to 31 points. Geelong began the last quarter with scoring 2 goals and extended the margin to 39 points, but Essendon began to run over the top of Geelong, bringing the margin down to just 9 points entering time on. Dick Reynolds was instrumental in this passage of play. For the last 5 minutes, Geelong locked the ball inside their forward half of the ground. They did not kick an icing-on-the-cake goal, but did score 2 behinds to extend the lead to its final margin of 11 points. Geelong had prevented the Essendon three-peat. Geelong had won the VFL Premiership for a 4th time. To this day, Essendon fans of the era still blame John Coleman for being the main reason for Essendon's failure to win the 1951 Jubilee Premiership, and he was unquestionably a huge miss. But Geelong had the winner of the 2 most important individual awards. In addition to leading goal kicker Gonyan, Bernie Smith, after having played for 3 seasons at North Adelaide, which included a premiership win, was recruited to Geelong for 1949. In 1951, he pulled 23 votes and won the Brownlow Medal and was instrumental on Grand Final day. He was inducted in the Australian Football Hall of Fame in its first year of existence in 1996. Geelong had, to this point, never won back-to-back grand finals. Their 2 sets of 3 straight VFA premierships, loyal viewers of this series will remember from the era I'm dubbing the newspaper era, when it comes to deciding the premiership, had no grand final. Well, 1878 technically did, albeit unofficially. In 1952, Geelong got off to a fabulous start to the season, winning their first 6 matches of the brand new season. The first loss for Geelong occurred in round 7, losing by 27 points, always well behind Carlton. This was ahead of a unique weekend in the history of the league. The 1952 season is the only one where the teams played 19 games. The year before and after, teams played 18. But in an effort to grow the game nationally, the VFL played matches of round 8 held on the Queen's birthday weekend all around Australia in the cities of Sydney, Hobart, Albury, Aurora, Yulrin and Brisbane. the latter where Geelong will play Essendon in a grand final rematch. Perhaps surprisingly, the national round didn't go well, with bad weather affecting many games that weekend, but most notably the game in Brisbane. What was clearly the most important game that weekend, the match at the Brisbane Exhibition Ground, was postponed to the Monday night due to heavy rainfall. 5 inches of rainfall, in fact. 28,000 people attended the postponed match, with 2,000 people entering without a ticket. This match was the first in V/AFL history played for Premiership points under the lights. John Coleman put on a show, kicking a lazy 13 goals. Yep, he was a big miss for the Bombers in the grand final. Essendon thrashed Geelong with a 69-point victory, handing Geelong their second loss of the season. 6 Essendon players, including Coleman, suffered air sickness on the flight home, with the Tuesday morning flight from Brisbane not arriving until 11 p.m. at Melbourne Airport rather than the intended Essendon Airport. Cats president Jack Jennings was not happy, saying, "Our team didn't return to Geelong until 7 p.m. This round has completely disorganised our training schedule." He then threw in the immortal line, "Brisbane is too far away. We don't think it's right to take players 1,300 miles to play a game for Premiership points." Oh, how poorly that has aged. For the record, despite this national round, dubbed propaganda round by the press, being planned to be an annual thing, the clubs won out and it was a one-off until 2020, where all of round 6 was played north of the Barassi line as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Geelong would go on to win its next 2 matches following the national round before round 11 came around, which would see the matches from the national rounds done again, this time in venues VFL fans were familiar with. This saw Geelong and Essendon face off yet again. Despite the wind hindering the end Essendon was attacking to in the first quarter of the matchup at Windy Hill, Coleman outmarked his man to score the first 2 goals of the match. But Geelong responded, and their brilliant display saw Geelong find 2 quick goals to respond before adding another 4 goals in a row to go into quarter time 27 points up. Essendon legends Bill Hutchison and Coleman were instrumental in bringing Essendon back into the game in the second quarter. Essendon only trailed by 14 points at half time. McMaster kicked 2 clever goals at the start of the third quarter, which helped give the Cats a 5-goal lead, reduced to a 4-goal lead at three-quarter time. In the last, Essendon had the advantage of the wind and came fighting all the way back. Coleman added his 4th to level the scores, and despite all the attacking, Essendon couldn't find another score. The match ended a 76-76 draw. It was the 9th draw Geelong had experienced in the VFL. Essendon were left to rue what might have been in front of goals. They kicked more inaccurately, but Geelong would have felt more disappointed given they were in front for the vast majority of the match. As a result of the draw, Collingwood's win over Richmond was enough to jump the Cats into first place, with Essendon well off the pace in 7th. Remember how I said in the last episode of this series that we would meet Geelong's best ever team? Well, this 1950s Cats are that team, and here is why. Those Essendon matches, a loss in Brisbane and a draw at Windy Hill, will be the last time Geelong failed to win for a while. The match of round 12 had to be the top of the ladder contest at Kardinia Park between Geelong and Collingwood, and Geelong, after a few shaky performances, would keep the Pikes to just a 4-goal afternoon, less than Fred Flanagan, who kicked 5, and with a 29-point victory, Geelong returned to the top of the ladder. Geelong won all remaining matches for the 1952 home and away season, a full game and a sizable amount of percentage ahead of the second place Magpies team. The two teams had met twice already this season, round 3 at Victoria Park, where Geelong won by 25, and the aforementioned 29-point round 12 Kardinia Park win, in front of a then record crowd for a second semi-final of 77,417 people. Geelong dominated Collingwood, the intensity well out of the game before the final siren. While the start was a bit of a nervy one for the Cats, they began to outmark Collingwood in their impressive fast pace of play. Was an enjoyable watch for onlookers. Geelong justified their claim for the best team in the league and ensured they would be red-hot favourites on grand final day. Collingwood defeated Fitzroy by 19 points in the preliminary final to set up the grand final contest. Previous encounters suggest fast patches of play, and this was no exception. Geelong's kicking was poor throughout the first half as Collingwood attempted to counter the Cats. The Geelong defence began to assert dominance as Collingwood were unable to establish many real chances when they went forward. The game was a slugfest, Geelong leading 26-7 at quarter time. The second quarter was a poor one in terms of overall quality. But Collingwood managed to kick 2 goals to Geelong's 1 to keep themselves in the match at halfway stage. Geelong led 33-21. It was the third quarter where the defending premiers announced themselves. A Gonyan goal began a run of Geelong scoring. It was evident Collingwood was tiring at three-quarter time in the aftermath of a 6-goal third term from the team in blue and white, which had resulted in a 39-point margin at the final interval. The last quarter was merely a formality, and only 3 goals, 2 for Geelong and 1 for Collingwood, were scored. Gonyan cemented his place as a catch champion with 5 goals on the day, as many as the Magpies had, and the game ended as a 46-point Geelong victory. For the first time since 1883, Geelong had gone back-to-back. First time they'd ever done it in the VFL. To make things go from bad to worse for Collingwood, later that evening, £300 was stolen from a safe from a social bar in the Collingwood change rooms, taken by thieves who smashed a door to enter the room. Reg Hickey had taken a team who was on the seafloor in the mid-40s and taken them to back-to-back success at the start of the 50s. A crowd of 10,000 people greeted the Cats as they arrived back home at City Hall at 9:20 that night. The back-to-back VFL premiers. You'd think that would rather settle any debate about the perception of this football team, but a piece was written in the Argus the Monday after with the headline, "Geelong lets down its reputation." The funny part about this article, its source is Dick Reynolds. Yes, the same Dick Reynolds whose last match was to those very Cats. So let's put their achievement into some historical context. They had won their last 10 matches and hadn't actually lost since the game in Brisbane, as the Cats won 2 matches before the draw to Essendon, meaning they concluded 1952 with a 10-game winning streak and a 12-game unbeaten one. Those 10 straight wins were won by a combined margin of 374. That's an average of 37.4. About that game in Brisbane, Geelong were the first team to win a premiership in this competition to have played in Brisbane at some point in the season. The second, the 1995 Carlton Blues, due to the Brisbane Bears not playing in Brisbane proper until 1991, 1993 full-time, and with the 93 Blues, along with the 94 Eagles not playing in Brisbane en route to their flags, we had to wait until the 1995 Carlton side to see a team, for the second time ever, go to Brisbane en route to a premiership victory. Victorian Governor Sir Dallas Brooks unfurled the premiership flag before Geelong's round 6 match at home against South Melbourne. Geelong started the season brilliantly, including a 25-point win against Collingwood in round 3 at Victoria Park. It would ultimately be Collingwood that ended the great period of success in Geelong's history. The 23 straight winning, 25 straight undefeated run ended in Geelong with a 20-point victory for the Magpies at Kardinia Park. Geelong suffered back-to-back defeats with a narrow 11-point loss to Essendon the week after, but still finished top of the ladder with a record of 15-3, a loss to South Melbourne in the final round of the season. The other loss. After a week's rest, Geelong was ready to face Collingwood for a spot in the grand final. The game was in the balance for much of the first half. Not much separated either of these two well-matched sides, but it was Geelong in front at half-time by just a 3-point margin. It was the third quarter that was a real disaster for the Geelong side. Summed up in one stat, 1 goal 8. 1 goal 8 was all Geelong could muster in the third term. Collingwood, for their part, only scored on 3 occasions in that quarter, and yet only trailed by a margin of 3 points going into the final term. Geelong had their chance and they had failed to take it. In the last quarter, Collingwood were able to hold off the usually stylish Geelong forward line. George Gonyan had a quieter day, and Geelong scored just the 1 goal in the last. The Magpies, however, ran over the top of the Cats, running them off their legs, kicking 6 goals 5 in the last term to overcome a tied Geelong side to end up winning quite comfortably by 30 points, despite trailing at the end of each of the first 3 quarters. After defeating Footscray in the preliminary final the week after, many still like Geelong's chances of doing what they denied Essendon of doing in 1951, that is, win the league premiership for a 3rd consecutive time. But pointers suggested to a game that was not going to end with a lopsided margin. The game, much like the second semi-final, was an arm wrestle in the first quarter. It became clear that if Geelong were to win, they would have to surpass a Collingwood backline that was brilliantly holding them off. Most of the time they went forward, but with just a 2-point Collingwood lead after 1 quarter, the match was very much in the balance. The second quarter was another painful one for Geelong. They were dominant, particularly in the first half of the term when it comes to having possession of the ball, but were incapable of finishing chances, kicking just 1 goal and 7 behinds, which included a span of 5 in a row. Meantime, Collingwood scored 3 goals too, which gave them a 9-point lead at half-time. Much like the second semi-final, the turning point was the third quarter. This time for Collingwood brilliance rather than Geelong Geelong incompetence. 4 goals in 10 minutes extended the lead to 35 points, which Geelong were able to diminish to 29 at the last change. Geelong's chances weren't helped when McMaster had to leave the game in the third quarter due to a concussion and bruised thigh. He was taken to St Vincent's Hospital for observation. Geelong began to show more fight towards the end of the third, which continued into the last quarter, but the Collingwood defence held firm. Ron Hovey came on in the third quarter to try and add an important spark for the Cats up forward, but only managed 1-3. The story of the match, Geelong's inaccuracy. The Cats kicked 3-6 to 1-1 in the last and would go down 8-17-65 to 11-11-77. Best score in footy. It was Collingwood's first premiership in 17 years in front of a crowd of 89,060. Geelong had blown a chance to win a premiership due to poor grand final kicking against a rival. Not for the last time. 1954 was the fourth straight season Geelong finished as the minor premier. This was in spite of losing Gagnon, who quit Geelong to focus on his business career for the first part of the season. He did return to 11 games in 1954, his last season. Gagnon, by the way, was dropped after the semi-final loss due to his poor performance, but also due to his marriage infidelity. No, you didn't hear that incorrectly. That is why, in part, Geelong lost their most important goal-kicking piece in a grand final where they kicked poorly and lost by 2 goals. Gagnon will not get a fitting victorious finale to his career, as the 1954 finals were the worst finals performance of the Hickey era when it comes to expectation versus outcome, going down a Footscray despite beating the Bulldogs by 4 points at home in round 9 and going on to lose to Melbourne in the preliminary final. It was clear Hickey's Cats' glory days were over, but they managed a preliminary final appearance in 1955 before a semi-final exit in 1956 before whatever 1957 was. Geelong went from 13 wins and third place in 1956 to 5 wins in dead last in 1957. It would get even worse with just 4 wins in 1958. These seasons are important to measure because it is the last occasions the Geelong Football Club finished at the bottom of a VFL or AFL ladder. In 1959, the Hickey years finished. To take over was none other than the captain of the side from 1955 to 1958, Bob Davis, and improvement was there to be seen, up to 6 wins in 1960 to 10 wins in 1961. 1962, a 14-win season, got Geelong up to second place and back into a real finals chance. They were outplayed by a far better Essendon in the second semi-final before playing a Carlton side for a spot in the grand final. The 1962 preliminary final was a classic. Geelong won a tight first quarter and then dominated the second to go 3 goals clear, before Carlton came fighting their way back to get the margin to just 2 points 3-quarter time, when Paul Vinar kicked a behind that put Geelong a clear 2 goals in front, 2.5 minutes into time on. Things looked difficult for Carlton. But a lovely flick pass, back when that was legal, from Tom Carroll to Marie Sankey kept Carlton in it. Then moments later, Carroll marked on the lead before going back to kick the second goal in quick succession for the Blues to level the game. Carlton went forward once more after Silvani was awarded a free kick for a high tackle. His kick was marked in the pack by John James 50 yards from goal, but time had run out.
He marks it on the half-forward line. That was a Brownlow medal mark. That was courage personified. James from centre half forward uses a drop kick. It's a beauty too. It's a long kick into the full forward line. Roy West goes up. The siren goes, and it's a tie.
For the 4th time in VFL history, a final finished a draw. The others for the record were 1928 Collingwood Melbourne, 1946 Essendon Collingwood, and most famously of the 4, the 1948 grand final between Essendon and Melbourne. Like those occasions, the teams would suit up next week for the replay. Normally, replays tend to be quite one-sided. We saw this in 1990 and 2010, but this was not the case in 1962. The replay was as much as a close classic as the original. Carlton was just 5 points up in the dying stage of that match before Doug Wade, the leading goal kicker for 1962, playing in his second season for the Cats, and who had already had a bag of 6, had taken a mark 30 yards from goal. This is Wade mere seconds after that happened. Why so angry? Well, because umpire Jack Irving had not awarded a mark. He awarded a holding free kick for Carlton against Wade for holding the shorts of fullback Peter Barry. To his dying days, Irving believed Wade was guilty of holding.
That's true?
Well, how could I take a mark at the same time?
Yeah. Did that decide the game, that decision?
Well, it could have. I was only about 70 metres out, so I was...
It's well within your reach.
No, I was about 30 metres out, right in front. Yeah, and I kicked 6 straight.
Did you have hold of his shorts?
No, I held him with my body.
Really?
I stood my ground and took the mark in front, yeah.
So there was no holding?
None whatsoever, no.
So what possessed Jack to...
He still, to the day he died, he still said I held his shorts.
Yeah.
I became very good friends with Jack.
Barry was not able to take his free kick on account of the siren sounding before he was able to. Carlton win by 5 points. The only thing I've learned from researching footy history amidst a footy season is you realise just how many times things have already happened. You want to complain about the rules / the umpiring, join the 16.5 decade long list. What wasn't up for debate was Geelong was going on the right track under Davis. There was a piece missing. Geelong needed one more star that could really give them the hope of challenging. Well, Geelong had it. He just got injured, so couldn't play in 1962. Here he is, Graham Polly Farmer. This West Australian always had an eye on Victoria. He would have actually gone to Richmond in 1955, but his then club, East Perth, blocked the move. It was Davis who convinced him to head over to Victoria to play for Geelong. After his knee injury saw him miss out for 1962, he would not be denied for 1963. The season started well for Geelong, winning by 59 over South Melbourne, only to lose by that same margin against Essendon the following week. Geelong won 4 matches in a row before playing out a 66-66 draw against Hawthorn, perhaps a sign that, like 1952, 1963 would end with the Holy Grail in Geelong hands. Following a loss to Melbourne and win over Richmond, Geelong were able to rest up before their next match, as round 10 for 1963 was a split round as the VFL representative team were playing Western Australia in Perth on June 29 and against South Australia in Adelaide on July 6. It was on that latter day when Geelong took on Fitzroy away, looking to continue their good start to the season. This, by all accounts, was going to be a match that was glossed over, one that just sort of happened. No Melbourne radio stations bothered to assign a commentator to broadcast the match. Fitzroy was on a 10-game losing streak, having lost their last match of 1962 and then having gone winless all season to this point. The draw to Hawthorn meant both the Hawks and the Cats were just 2 points adrift of ladder leaders Essendon, with Fitzroy 2 games behind Richmond, who was sitting in second last place. While big name players were missing because of the interstate match, Doug Wade announced a Lord for Geelong, and Kevin Murray and Graham Campbell for Fitzroy. The depth of Geelong meant the loss of those two, as great as Wade and Lord were for Geelong in that era, meant that the loss of those two didn't raise any concerns. Another man who would be missing from the match because he was in Adelaide for the interstate match, none other than the Geelong coach, Bob Davis, which meant that Neil Trezise, who had retired from senior football at the helm of the 1959 VFL season, having played 185 senior games over 11 seasons, will be at the helm instead. He was appointed Geelong Reserves captain coach for the 1960 season, and since 1963 he was the non-playing coach of the reserves. This was merely a fill-in. Basically, stay home by yourself while the parents are out and try not burn down the place. As for Fitzroy, they also had a fill-in coach, Wally Clark, who had played for Fitzroy's first, second and thirds over more than a decade. Clark had retired from senior football at the end of the 1962 VFL season, having played 105 senior games over 8 seasons, ending his career as the team's top goal scorer with 21 goals. He was appointed as captain coach of the Fitzroy Reserves for the 1963 season. Both Clark and Trezise had, in their capacity as captain coach for their respective side, won the Reserves Grades Best and Fairest Award, the Gardner Medal. Trezise in 1960 and Clark in 1963. Clark's job was more like that of a substitute teacher. Just make sure nothing embarrassing happens and you've done a sufficient job. Clark, however, took it seriously and welcomed many Fitzroy supporters into the club rooms before the game, something not done by regular coach Murray. He delivered an inspiring speech, which meant the Lions were ready to go. Having won the toss, Fitzroy captain Ron Harvey chose to kick with the breeze, and the first quarter went all Fitzroy's way. In fact, Geelong looked a little shell-shocked. Fitzroy scored 3 goals for, and Geelong, from 8 shots on goal, only managed 6 behinds. In the second quarter, with the wind at their back, Geelong still weren't able to do much as Fitzroy defenders threw themselves into contest and held them out at every turn. Geelong only managed 1 score, a goal, And while Fitzroy had only managed 3 behinds, their lead at half-time was 13 points, in a game where Geelong had only scored 12 points so far. Clark made another inspiring speech at half-time in a room filled with loyal and excited Fitzroy supporters, who must have known they were close to getting their first win of the season. The third quarter was all Fitzroy. 5 goals, 4 to 1 goal, 3, and as Fitzroy turned for home, 38 points up, Geelong fans, who had only seen 21 points scored all day by the Cats, must have been in dismay. While they had their wind at their back in the last, they only added 1 more goal. Geelong had gone goalless in the first and kicked only 1 goal in the second, third and fourth. Both teams had kicked 13 behind, but Fitzroy kicked 6 more goals, and that was the final margin. While 3 goals 13 is terrible, the fact of the matter is it wouldn't have been right if Geelong had won this game. Fitzroy had helped play the Cats in every area. By bumping Farmer at throw-ins and bounces, his impact was kept to a quiet one, and not a single left-footer scored a goal for Geelong that day. Clark had managed to pull off the impossible. The miracle match is beyond comprehension, as is this. This is the only time Fitzroy won a match all season. It is Clark's one and only match as a VFL senior coach. Likewise for Trezise, who had completely failed to keep the house from burning. Despite having won their games against Fitzroy easily, the seconds and the thirds joined the seniors the Tuesday after this game in a special 100-minute meeting, which included all members of the club's selection committee. How Geelong would bounce back from the miracle match would determine its 1963 season. On the Saturday after the miracle match, the VFL's Adverse Weather Committee, by unanimous decision, postponed all round 11 matches due to reports that the majority of the grounds upon which games were scheduled to be played were completely waterlogged. Round 11 was pushed back to the following Saturday, and in the process, the whole season was pushed back a week later. It was not the only sporting event that had to be called off that day either. The entire Grand National Steeple meeting at a waterlogged Flemington racecourse was also postponed. Geelong's game after the miracle match was against Collingwood at home, and Geelong won it by 12 points. And Geelong won their next match, and the one after it. In fact, they did not lose a single match post the miracle match in the home and away season, finishing with 13 wins, 4 losses and 1 draw. The same record as another team. If you've been paying attention, you'll know that is Hawthorn. The two teams had played in round 18 at Glenferrie Oval. Geelong had not yet secured a spot in the 4. It was between the Cats as well as Melbourne, St Kilda and Essendon for the final 3 spots. Geelong won the match against a Hawthorn team with nothing to play for by 48 points, which was a big enough margin to knock the Hawks off first place, not that it would have changed the second semi-final matchup of Hawthorn and Geelong. Geelong finished the second semi-final brilliantly, going on to win by 19 points. Hawthorn were without their leading goal kicker John Peck, and for the grand final, Alistair Lord was to return for Geelong. The first 3 quarters ensured the game, like many other Geelong-Hawthorn matches, were closely contested. Hawthorn led by 3 points at quarter time before a 4-goal second quarter, but the Cats 16 points up. The Hawks reduced that margin to just 10 points the last change before Geelong pulled away in the last. Paulie Farmer, an integral part of Geelong's performance on that day. A 6-0 last quarter sealed the first VFL Premiership for Geelong in 11 years, winning by 49 points in front of a crowd of 101,209. Once again, Geelong were welcomed home that Saturday night in front of a 10,000 strong crowd. Holding high the VFL Premiership Cup, newly minted Premiership coach Bob Davis said, "This cup is for you. It is for Geelong. Your support has brought players to Geelong, and we have tried to justify your hopes. You have been with us through lean years, and now in success. Tonight is yours as much as it is ours." Bob Davis had turned the ship around dramatically. Geelong had only gone from the bottom of the VFL in just a handful of years. They'd overcome hard-done umpiring and the most remarkable upset in league history that other teams might very well have thought more about. They used that Fitzroy loss, a match they should not have lost, to ensure they would not lose another match all season. This was a crazy era. It had everything. I've discussed close matches, we've had a couple of draws, a trip to Brisbane, controversial umpiring, insane upsets, heartbreak in front of goals. This era had the lot, and Geelong fans in 1963 must have been thinking that the Davis era would only get more premierships. In fact, during that homecoming at Town Hall, Graham Farmer said, "This is a wonderful city and club, and we shall keep on winning premierships." Alistair and Stuart Lord agreed, with John Yates saying, "Be here in 1964. Well, Unfortunately for them, this wasn't the case. Fortunately for you, dear viewer, though, that means the last 2 episodes of this series will all be visual. No more screenshots or downloaded images, because next time, football is in colour. It's more national. It's making more money than ever. And the premierships that follow the greatest Geelong team's ever seen is the greatest dynasty the club has ever seen.